Today, I'd like to share some of the science on this: a surgical mask and other face coverings. Protective masks have been used in healthcare for many years. But how did all this begin? And how effective are they really? Mask wearing has been practiced for centuries by cultures all over the world for ritual, celebration, and even more. But some of the earliest examples of mask wearing in medicine appeared around the 1600s when physician Charles Delorme created the earliest versions of a hazmat suit, featuring a waxed fabric overcoat, a lengthy cane to examine people without touching them, and a menacing beaked mask that had a surprising intent behind its design. You see, medical professionals at the time believed in the miasmatic cause of illness and disease transmission, or what they would refer to as, quote, bad air. So the enclosed beak mask wasn't to specifically defend against the bad air. It was used to inhale good air by stuffing the beak full of herbs and spices. The practitioner could now sniff the good air in the mask to crowd out the bad air. We may think that this was a long time ago, but the miasmatic theory of disease didn't become obsolete until the 20th century. By this time, the germ theory of disease had fully taken hold, and by the early 1900s, physicians were now beginning to wear preliminary versions of surgical masks with a primary function of protecting the patient from contamination and surgical site infection. It eventually became common practice for healthcare workers to wear masks in the operating room. Though as more hygienic practices have been incorporated into surgical settings, several scientists have sought out to discover whether or not the ritual of wearing a mask in surgery had a high level of effectiveness in preventing infections. Surprisingly, several studies, including a meta-analysis published in 2016 in Cochrane Systematic Review, found that when physicians wore a mask or didn't wear a mask, quote, there was no statistically significant difference in infection rates between the masked and unmasked group in any of the trials, end quote. Even over 100 years after the inception of the face mask in surgery, the researchers noted that at best, quote, it is unclear whether wearing surgical face masks result in any harm or benefit to the patient undergoing clean surgery, end quote. Other studies published in the Journal of Hospital Infections and more have also concluded that the use of surgical masks in surgery are obsolete and unnecessary. Researchers at the Center for Infectious Disease Research and Policy summarized it by stating that, quote, clinical trials in the surgery theater have found no difference in wound infection rates with and without surgical masks. Despite these findings, it has been difficult for surgeons to give up a long-standing practice, end quote. Surgical masks were developed to be used in surgery, yet have been found to be ineffective in their purpose to reduce rates of infection. But surgical masks have recently taken on a new role and are now being touted for their use in helping to reduce the spread of communicable infections within the general population. So let's take a look at how well surgical masks and other face coverings do in the presence of viruses, bacteria, and other pathogens. It appears to be obvious that blocking one's mouth and nose would prevent the spread of bacteria, viruses, and other microbes. Yet, these microscopic entities don't operate on the obvious. In fact, they operate in a way that defies surface-level logic altogether. In reality, the actual size and capability of a bacteria and viruses just might shock you. Using the size of a human hair as a comparison, a single strand of hair is about 80 micrometers in thickness. To get to the size of a single bacteria cell, you'll have to divide the size of a hair by 40. A single bacteria cell is just 2 micrometers or 1/40th the width of a hair. Now here's where it gets really uncanny. A virus particle is too small to be measured in micrometers. It's measured in nanometers. And at the size of about 17 to 140 nanometers, you can actually fit hundreds or even thousands of viruses into a single bacteria cell. These pathogens are inordinately small, and the protective pore size of conventional cloth and surgical masks are gigantic compared to viruses. Virus particles could slip through as easily as flies going through a chain link fence. But the potential benefit of a mask is that viruses travel from our bodies via aerosols and droplets. Whether you are talking, shouting, sneezing, coughing, or simply breathing, you are continuously emitting aerosols and droplets into the air. Think about how you can sometimes see your breath on a cold day. The change in humidity allows you to better see what's often invisible, but always happening. These tiny, sometimes invisible droplets contain an array of bacteria cells and viruses, and droplets typically measure between 5 and 10 micrometers in diameter. This is large enough to get caught by the filtering action of a conventional mask when you cough or exhale. And those that escape your mask would theoretically fall to the floor because of their density. But the strange thing is that almost all droplets will evaporate before hitting the ground and free the virus particles within them to remain in the air longer, meaning that they can transmit disease through the airborne route for anyone who walks into them. Aerosols are what form when smaller droplets evaporate faster than they can fall to the ground. They play by different rules and can enable viruses to remain in the air for several minutes or even up to a couple of hours, according to the CDC. The purpose of face masks is advocated to keep your microbes contained and protect other people from you. According to the United States FDA, if worn properly, a surgical mask is meant to help block large particle droplets that may contain germs, keeping it from reaching your mouth and nose. But while a surgical mask may be effective in blocking large particle droplets, a face mask, by design, does not filter or block very small particles in the air that may be transmitted by coughs, sneezes, or certain medical procedures. Surgical masks also do not provide complete protection from germs and other contaminants because of the loose fit between the surface of the mask and your face. So even though some of the larger particles can be trapped in the mask and reduce forward projection, with a special type of imaging technique, we can now see that when someone breathes, talks, sneezes, or coughs into a mask, the forward disbursement of aerosols and droplets is reduced. And instead, the microbes are dispersed above the mask, below the mask, out the sides, and even through the mask itself, based on the material of the mask and how tightly it's sealed. There is a range of protection from makeshift cloth mask to medical mask, but this disbursement of virus particles is still occurring. And this is what most people are not being educated about. It's the fact that when we breathe, talk, cough, or sneeze into a mask, we are all still spreading millions of virus particles and bacteria into our environment. And all it takes is just one virus particle to infect someone and set off a cascade of infectious disease. Again, viruses can remain in the air for a couple of minutes or even a couple of hours. And data cited in the New England Journal of Medicine noted that aerosols from infected persons may pose an inhalation threat even at considerable distances, and especially in enclosed spaces, particularly if there's poor ventilation. So how does this data regarding masks and the behavior of viruses play out in the real world? Well, a randomized peer-reviewed study published in the BMJ looked at the efficacy of masks to prevent viral infection in hospital healthcare workers in 15 different hospitals. The participants were randomized into 3 groups. One group wore medical masks at all time on their work shift. A second group wore cloth masks at all time on their shift. And the third group, the control group, was allowed general practice, which included occasionally wearing a mask or not wearing a mask at all. Here's what the study found. A percentage of healthcare workers in all groups contracted infections, but the participants wearing cloth masks had significantly higher rates of infections than the participants wearing surgical masks. In fact, healthcare workers wearing cloth masks were 13 times more likely to experience viral type infections than those wearing medical masks. Now, here's what's even more shocking about the study. Not only were the rates of infections higher in the cloth mask wearing group than the medical mask group, the rates of infection in the cloth mask group were significantly higher than the people in the control group who were allowed to occasionally wear a mask or not even wear a mask at all. Please listen to that again. This real-world setting, peer-reviewed study found that you are more likely to contract a viral infection by excessively wearing a cloth mask than not strictly wearing a mask or wearing no mask at all. This is not to say that a mask cannot be helpful in acute situations, but being advised to wear a cloth face mask could be outright dangerous. The researchers found that the penetration of cloth masks by particles was almost 97%, and medical masks about 44%. The medical masks didn't do particularly well, but the performance of the cloth masks were absolutely horrendous. The scientists in the study collected enough data to conclude that the wearing of a cloth mask can potentially increase your risk of getting sick. But the question is, why? The researchers stated that, quote, moisture retention and poor filtration may result in increased risk of infection with cloth masks, and that cloth mask should not be recommended, end quote. The data shows that the cloth mask material actually creates a reservoir for pathogen growth, a wet, trapped environment where your own microbes, as well as pathogens from the environment around you, increasingly stick to the mask and colonize. Where in the natural world, your droplets would be diluted into the air, you are, in essence, creating a wet microhabitat on your face that can make it even better at collecting other people's microbes on it. A 2015 study conducted by scientists at Oxford University found that, quote, the accumulation of moisture during prolonged usage may exacerbate this problem by increasing resistance to airflow. Moisture accumulation is also thought to facilitate the movement of contaminants through the material of the mask itself, end quote. Unfortunately, public health officials have repeatedly endorsed cloth masks to the public, and these recommendations have led to an explosion in companies creating and selling cloth face masks. It may have been well-intentioned, but it was not based on valid science. Now, what may be even more unanticipated is that these effects are seen in other types of masks too. In fact, the study from Oxford revealing that moisture accumulation and airflow resistance can facilitate the movement of more microbes through the mask was actually done on surgical masks. And the data shows that the longer these and other types of masks are kept on, the more problems start to arise with their effectiveness. A meta-analysis of 19 randomized controlled trials published in the International Journal of Nursing Studies examined the effectiveness of masks in reducing infections in 8 community settings, 6 healthcare settings, and 5 as source control. The study concluded that, quote, medical masks were not effective and cloth masks were even less effective, end quote. What's even less effective than not effective? That means in the real world, clinical evidence shows that they're worthless and at worst, potentially dangerous. The confusing part for the public is that they see health organizations and news reports that actually recommend cloth masks even above medical masks based off of unrealistic studies where people put on a mask for a minute, cough into a petri dish, and then take the mask off. Then the study's like, see, these masks work great, but that is not how things work in the real world. This should all be a little bit alarming because all most people are hearing is to just wear something. Anything helps. And this idea is based on very rudimentary beliefs about droplets and aerosols. Yes, a mask can reduce the distance of them projecting forward, but they're not suddenly disappearing into a black hole when you cough or breathe into a mask. They're spraying above the mask, below the mask, out of the sides, and even through the mask as well. They're spreading all over your clothes, your face, your hair, and the environment around you. And to top it off, the moisture trap created by encasing your mouth and nose within the mask creates a reservoir for pathogen growth that encourages the movement of microbes through the mask itself. Unfortunately, the push to get new data out to affirm the efficacy of these masks are extremely speculative and engendering a false sense of security in the mask's abilities. One of the most recent studies boasted the headline that surgical masks can reduce the spread of COVID-19 by up to 75%. But if you actually examine the data, you'd find that the courageous study participants tasked with simulating real-life situations were hamsters. Hamsters were injected with COVID-19 and placed into cages in plastic boxes next to another cage of uninfected hamsters. The cages were separated by a hole because, they're simulating human situations, right? In some parts of the study, they put a surgical mask between the hole. Other times, they didn't. These were the conditions in which they came up with the 75% effectiveness figure. The lead researcher in the study said, quote, in our hamster experiment, it shows very clearly that if infected hamsters or humans, especially asymptomatic or symptomatic ones, put on a mask, they actually protect other people. How in the hamster can they say the study shows anything, quote, very clearly? The most troubling part is that countless people, including health professionals, have referenced this study to claim the efficacy of masks to prevent viral infections. While studies, conducted in real-world settings prove otherwise. I should not have to say this, but this study wasn't done in real-world conditions. And I should not have to say that we are, in fact, not hamsters isolated in cages with the hole separating us from each other. But at a time when so many people like to latch on to minutia and totally miss the bigger picture and the science, I have to say it blatantly. Another recent study conducted by researchers at Texas A&M declared that face masks prevented more than 66,000 infections in New York City in less than a month. The lead researcher stated that, quote, by analyzing the pandemic trends without face covering, using the statistical method, and by projecting the trend, we calculated that over 66,000 infections were prevented by using a face mask in a little over 1 month in New York City, end quote. Yet again, if you read into the study, it's a study affirming how droplets and aerosols travel, which we already know, and not a study on mask effectiveness. The claims that the mask prevented 66,000 infections are based on hasty assumptions of universal consistency in mask quality, mask fit, duration of time worn, assumptions that the wearers aren't touching their face, that their aerosols and droplets aren't being deflected and sprayed all over their face, hair, clothes, and creating clouds of droplets from above, below, and through the sides of the mask. And it's also assuming that the masks are effective in the first place, which the vast majority of real-world clinical trials we've covered already show that they're not. Their gross estimates also fail to differentiate the effects that shelter-in-place and social distancing mandates had versus wearing a mask in public. In fact, the infection rates were already trending down when the stay-at-home mandates were in place. And this study suddenly gives unsubstantiated credit to face masks. The assumption of universal conditions is not how science works, and it's not how viruses work in the real world. The lead researcher in the study stated that, quote, our work also highlights that sound science is essential in decision-making for the current and future public health pandemics, end quote. If this is sound science, we're all going to need to get our ears checked. Because herein lies the problem in the real world. Inaccurate, speculative research like this is determining decision-making for the current and future public health issues. There are more holes in their theories than a fresh pair of Crocs. Yet, once it's embedded into the minds of the public, false assumptions and bad science begin to spread like wildfire. Now let's look at the effectiveness of the most prestigious type of mask and how it stacks up against the surgical mask. Remembering that virus particles generally range from 17 to 140 nanometers, the American Chemical Society has noted that the N95 mask filters about 85% of particles smaller than 300 nanometers. Yes, most viruses are much smaller than that, and no, it's not always effective. But going back to our science on aerosols and droplets, it's likely doing a better job at reducing viral spread than other masks, at least. But let's take a look at the boots on the ground data. A 2017 study conducted by Chinese researchers found that targeted, intermittent use of N95 respirators while doing high-risk procedures or caring for patients with known respiratory illness actually caused higher rates of viral infections in healthcare workers wearing the N95 mask than those wearing surgical masks. And even more surprising is that participants wearing the N95 mask had higher rates of infections than the control group who were not required to wear either type of mask. Wait, what? N95 respirators are supposed to be the gold standard. How on earth can they be outperformed by casual wearing or not wearing of masks seen in the control group? That didn't look too good on paper for the researchers. So they had another group who had to constantly wear the N95 mask for their entire shift. And lo and behold, it did outperform the surgical mask in the control group. The researchers now found a lower rate of droplet-related infections. However, the protection from confirmed influenza virus was not statistically significant. We could reasonably say there's mixed results here. So let's take a look at some of the other studies. In a randomized controlled trial of 446 nurses in emergency departments, medical units, and pediatric units, approximately half of the nurses were assigned to wear a surgical mask, and the other half were assigned to wear a fit-tested N95 respirator to study their effectiveness against the influenza virus. The 2.5-month study published in the Journal of the American Medical Association revealed that 23.6% of the nurses in the surgical mask group contracted the virus, while 22.9% of the N95 mask group contracted the virus. The effectiveness was almost identical. It's still not faring too well for the highly touted N95 mask, so let's look at more. In a meta-analysis published in the Canadian Medical Association Journal that included 6 clinical studies and 23 surrogate exposure studies, the scientists found no significant difference between the N95 respirators and surgical masks in associated risk of laboratory-confirmed respiratory infection or influenza-like illness. These are real-world examples of how effective these masks actually are. Not speculating, not making gross assumptions. This is how things work in reality. Even the very best mask doesn't consistently outperform the most useless mask because the entire premise of a mask is ignoring the nature of how pathogens actually spread throughout the environment. If this isn't alarming enough, there's another major issue that you need to know about. In the study that actually found some benefit in the N95 mask versus surgical mask, the healthcare workers were not allowed to take them off for their entire shift. But the data shows that, as with cloth masks, the longer they're kept on, the more problems start to arise. A peer-reviewed study published in 2004 fitted patients with N95 masks and monitored the physiological impact the mask had on their bodies. 70% of the patients showed a significant reduction in partial pressure of oxygen. Partial pressure of oxygen reflects how well oxygen is able to move from the lungs to the blood, and it is usually altered by severe illness. But in this case, it's being reduced by suffocating one's face with a mask. It's dangerous and a major component of hypoxemic respiratory failure, and we can no longer overlook that this is happening. Being that the N95 mask comes with substantial risk, researchers decided to look at the respiratory consequences of the N95 mask on pregnant expecting mothers. The controlled clinical study, published in the journal Antimicrobial Resistance and Infection Control, recruited pregnant healthcare workers to wear N95 masks while doing just low-intensity activity, and the results were shocking. Wearing the N95 mask reduced their normal value of air displaced by inhalation and exhalation by 23%. The volume of gas inhaled or exhaled, specifically from their lungs each minute, was reduced by 25.8%. Their volume of overall oxygen consumption was reduced by 13.8%, and the ability to expire carbon dioxide was reduced by 17.7%. You may think that these effects were due to wearing the mask for an extended amount of time, but they were engaged in low-intensity activity for just 15 minutes. The only reason this was discovered is because someone saw pregnant mothers covering their breathing pathways with a mask and asked whether this practice could be dangerous for the mother and the baby. But the truth is, this danger is occurring for all of us when we cover our breathing pathways. But someone had to have the courage to ask the question. Unfortunately, there are websites that claim to, quote, debunk that wearing a mask could cause oxygen deficiency. Even sites run by major health organizations. But their fact-checking seems to be scarce and even negligent in actually reviewing the facts. The data has been out there all along, right at our fingertips if we care to look at it, if our public health officials care to look at it, if our politicians care to look at it. But it seems that the ability to analyze and respect scientific data has been replaced by bandwagoning and agendas that in no way serve the public, except to immerse them in more fear, encourage agoraphobia, and instill a false sense of security in something that is not only proven to be ineffective, but is actually outright dangerous to our health. Another thing that's said to be, quote, debunked is that wearing a mask will cause carbon dioxide rebreathing. Yet, a peer-reviewed study published in the journal Anesthesia revealed that within just 20 minutes of wearing a mask, the mean end-tidal carbon dioxide levels jumped up 13%. The researchers reported that, quote, the rise in end-tidal carbon dioxide is due to rebreathing of expired gas that is trapped in the respirator. They also noted that, quote, levels of end-tidal carbon dioxide have also been shown to significantly impair cognitive and psychomotor performance, end quote. This means that in the real-world setting, you now become a greater risk to yourself and others. Another study published in the journal Ergonomics found that even at low work rates, wearing the mask contributed to significantly higher levels of CO2 rebreathing, with notable side effects such as fatigue, dizziness, headaches, and muscular weakness. And just focusing on one of those side effects being headaches, when mandated to wear N95 masks, a peer-reviewed study published in 2006 found that almost 40% of healthcare workers developed face mask-associated headaches. It's critical for us to realize that these reduced levels of oxygen can damage our lungs, your heart, and even damage your brain. And these dangerous effects aren't just seen in N95 masks either. Another peer-reviewed study published in 2008 reported surgical masks induced deoxygenation in physicians in surgery, while another study conducted by the CDC and published in the Annals of Work Exposure and Health revealed that by wearing a mask, the highly thermosensitive nature of the face and breathing pathways can be inhibited, leading to increased anxiety, elevated stress hormones, false suffocation alarm in the central nervous system, and panic attacks. What's clear is that within minutes of putting on a mask, dangerous effects begin to set in, whether you realize it consciously or not. And the longer masks are worn, the more devastating their effects can be. What's particularly alarming is that many schools are beginning to mandate children to wear masks for hours a day in order to be accepted back into the classroom. Keeping in mind that the benefits of masks are largely disproven and superficial, why on earth would we allow a society in which we put our children in harm's way by restricting their breathing for hours a day just to be able to get an education? The very heart of science is having the capacity to check your emotions and biases at the door and look at the data objectively. Not just the data that supports your belief, and especially not the data that has been emotionalized and politicized. I understand that the clinical evidence demonstrated here is not going to fit within the trending narrative. And with so much energy invested into making mask usage appear to be effective and ethical, many health professionals, public figures, and politicians will find it difficult to admit that they made a mistake and finally shift the conversation to actually getting our citizens healthier in clinically proven ways. But that's okay. It doesn't make the science any less real. And that's the thing about science. It doesn't care what you believe. Unfortunately, you can't believe your way into making masks more effective than they are. And you can't believe your way into masks not being utterly destructive to the health of ourselves and our children. And this isn't just a physical health issue. This is a mental health issue as well. What does seeing someone in a mask represent in our minds? A new study published in the Journal of Neuroscience affirmed how the brain immediately seeks out facial data to determine how trustworthy someone is and, accordingly, how safe or threatened you should feel. The researchers noted that our brains are specialized for recognizing faces. We identify each other by our faces and make instantaneous judgments about people. A person's face provides a wealth of information. Within seconds of seeing a face, we immediately know much about a person, including their gender, age, ethnicity, level of physical abilities, cues of sickness and disease, emotional state, and more. This data enables us to make informed decisions on how we should interact or not interact with a person. So why are masks so concerning for our mental health? It's because suddenly this innate human instinct to assess someone's face is shut off. In psychology, it has to do with the fear of the unknown. For most of us, seeing someone in a mask is associated with danger. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of years of evolution being suppressed. To our brains, if someone is approaching you and you cannot see their face, they pose an immediate threat. You can consciously try to tell yourself they're not a threat, but we can't take evolution and easily turn it off. Not being able to recognize who's behind the mask and what their intentions are is an automatic trigger for our sympathetic fight or flight nervous system. Now suddenly we're unable to do one of the things that makes us human. And many people are being driven into doing this indefinitely, not based on science, but based on fear. In developing children, this is an absolutely critical time for them to be able to see and read the faces of their peers as part of their mental and social development. Researchers have already noted a rise in childhood mental health issues resulting from the social lockdown and noted that, quote, the full toll of COVID-19 on children's mental health won't be known for years, end quote. It's up to us to help put an end to these problems because as of now, data published in the Canadian Medical Association Journal has already demonstrated massive increases in childhood stress disorders and depression caused by such dramatic changes in their daily social interactions. Now, going back to how simply seeing someone in a mask activates our fight or flight nervous system, this dangerous issue is further compounded by the act of covering our own faces as well. A study published in the International Archives of Occupational and Environmental Health found that there is a microclimate created within the mask that causes high breathing resistance, making it difficult for test subjects to breathe and take in sufficient oxygen. This shortage of oxygen hyperstimulates the sympathetic fight or flight nervous system. Another mask-related health problem that fact-checking reports have presumably, quote, debunked is that wearing a mask doesn't negatively affect your immune system. But, yet again, these reports fail to look at the facts regarding very basic human physiology. Scientists at the University of Edinburgh found that immune cells become overactive when oxygen levels are deranged, and they respond excessively to infection in a harmful way. A study published in the Journal of Evolutionary Biology found that hyperactivity of the fight or flight nervous system does increase immune gene expression, but it does not increase in a way that helps to fight infection. The scientists noted that abnormal stress, like what's caused by self-suffocation from a mask, is not an adaptive immune response. A short burst of inhibited breathing will have a nominal impact on your immune system, but the longer a mask is obstructing your breathing, the more abnormal levels of stress hormones are produced, and the more this activity becomes immunosuppressive, according to a study published in Integrative and Comparative Biology. At this point, you're probably wondering, how do ideas like mandated mask wearing catch on, even though they're inordinately false and even damaging to the public's health? Well, part of it is the status quo, the idea that, quote, this is what we've always done. As we discussed earlier, face masks have been used in medicine for several decades, even though they've been repeatedly proven to be ineffective. It's become integrated into the culture. As we shared at the beginning of this video, researchers at the Center for Infectious Disease Research and Policy summarize it by stating that, quote, clinical trials in the surgery theater have found no difference in infection rates with and without surgical masks. Despite these findings, it has been difficult for surgeons to give up the long-standing practice. If the trusted authorities believe in a thing that's untrue, the public has almost no chance to believe otherwise. Some people think, of course masks work. Why do you think doctors wear them? When in reality, it's based on ritual and not on science. Another reason false ideas catch on is that rituals tend to create cognitive biases. A cognitive bias is a systematic tendency that leads our thinking away from rational judgment, even when presented with proof that what we believe to be true is not actually true. We become so ingrained in our belief that anything that doesn't fit our model of perception is often belittled, fought against, or ignored altogether. Our minds tend to work like a puzzle. If we come in contact with a new piece of data that fits, we add it to the puzzle. If the data doesn't fit, we tend to discard it and throw it away. This puzzle picture we're creating works at lightning speed, and we normally don't realize it's happening. In the case of something highly emotionalized like mask wearing, something called a self-serving bias gets ramped up 1,000 times higher. A self-serving bias is a tendency to focus only on information that enhances the belief that we are right and rejects any information that we believe is incorrect. If a very smart person develops a self-serving bias for something that's not true, they can become world-class at teaching and defending something that's not true. Our minds are always looking for things to affirm that we are right. So we actually have to proactively fight against this tendency because it can lead to dangerous selective perception and make our minds miss all of the contradicting information that can be incredibly valuable for us. In order to see all of the data and come to a more accurate conclusion, I have to come into the research knowing that I have a cognitive bias and proactively look for data that proves me wrong. It's not always a comfortable thing to do, but it's necessary to have a well thought out, rational judgment. Especially in times of high emotion, it's more important than ever to develop this skill. If you're willing to be wrong, you'll be able to learn things that are outside of your biases. This will help you to make more effective decisions based on logic and not on fear. Another reason false ideas catch on is that cognitive biases are contagious. The need to fit in and be accepted is a basic human instinct. According to an analysis in Frontiers in Psychology, the social aspects of the human brain are always working to negotiate and navigate social environments. And when you're placed into a social construct, whether you were born into it or you buy into it, it creates the foundation for a groupthink to occur. Groupthink is a psychological phenomenon that manifests within a group of people where the desire for harmony or conformity in the group results in irrational or dysfunctional decision-making. Right or wrong, you catch the belief from the group and it deeply infects your thinking. The groupthink becomes the unconscious driving force, and ideas to support the groupthink are spread. For example, even though the data shows that wearing a mask is ineffective and even dangerous, catchphrases like, "It's an act of love," "It's just a small sacrifice," "It's not about you," and "Stop being selfish" are spread to affirm the belief of the group. It doesn't matter that it's irrational. The cognitive bias of the group makes it incredibly difficult to think otherwise. And it's not that statements like these are made with malintent. In fact, they can be made with great empathy and a desire to help the cause. But when the beliefs are born out of a self-destructive cognitive bias, it can easily take on a life of its own and breed irrational behavior. Again, this happens with very intelligent people all the time. Just take a look at researchers at Harvard University, for example. They recently published a report recommending that you should probably be wearing a mask to protect yourself during sexual situations right now. These researchers aren't just being strangely freaky. They really believe that they are helping the cause. And guess what? That advice is going to lead countless people to wear protection downstairs and upstairs as well. Not based on logic, but based on the influence of the groupthink. And with the spreading of irrational ideas, there's an additional phenomenon that occurs today more than ever. With the groupthink extending to celebrities and influencers, the power of celebrity politics is even more intrusive today. Celebrity politics is the act of a prominent person using their fame as a platform to influence others on ideology. Whether that ideology is wrong or not, other people tend to be more influenced by celebrities because narratives often persuade more than factual data. So when your favorite celebrity issues a mask challenge to encourage more celebrities and the public to wear their masks, it creates a tidal wave of bandwagoning behavior. One celebrity posted, quote, "We know wearing a mask can make it hard for you to breathe, but it's more about protection than comfort," end quote. But not being able to breathe normally is not an issue of comfort. The discomfort of covering your face is your body telling you that this is wrong and dangerous. But cognitive biases, groupthink, and celebrity politics can kick your logic right out of the window. There are other reasons why false ideas catch on that have to do with ulterior motives, fear, passivity, and more. Even many health professionals with good intentions have already accepted the prevailing beliefs regarding viruses and the effectiveness of masks, and their unconscious cognitive biases have them only looking for evidence to support their belief. It takes a huge amount of courage to look at the evidence that proves you're wrong, especially when you've publicly shown your belief in the wrong thing. It takes a huge amount of courage to say, you know what? I didn't do my due diligence and examine the data. I didn't look at all sides of this. I was wrong. I'm sorry. Now, let's talk about how we can make this right. We may think we've come a long way since the theory of miasmatic illnesses or bad air being the cause of disease. Yet today, millions of people are being told a very archaic belief that you must suffocate yourself in order to save yourself. The science clearly disproves the effectiveness of masks, especially for the general population. And by now you might be wondering, what else is being misrepresented or ignored in the messaging to the public? And what can we actually do to protect ourselves and our families? So let's shift gears for a moment and talk about what really works to protect the health and well-being of our citizens based on real clinical evidence. Now, what I'm about to share might be a little bit staggering, but there are massive pandemics every single year that most people don't know about. For example, the World Health Organization reported that upwards of 650,000 people die every single year from a specific infectious virus. And it's not the coronavirus, it's influenza. The same influenza that most of us see is not a big issue. The same influenza virus that conventional medicine keeps making drugs for. Up to 650,000 people's lives are lost from it, not just in a single year, but every year. And that's only counting the deaths related to the respiratory effects of influenza, and not even including the deaths from influenza-related seizures, organ failure, and more, which would add tens of thousands of more deaths on top of that. Thousands of people who take the supposed flu prevention drugs every single year still die. And the truth is, conventional medicine hasn't remotely figured this thing out. There's something that's been around killing millions of people for decades. Why on earth would we logically believe that COVID-19 will be any different? That in a few years we'll have a drug to protect us? A cognitive bias might tell us that it's different because the flu is tricky. It mutates. It keeps mutating every year. But peer-reviewed data in the journal Cell stated that COVID-19 has already mutated repeatedly, and it will continue to do so because that's what viruses do. That's how science works. But we still keep taking illogical approaches instead of paying attention to the data staring right in our faces. Do you want to know the connecting factor between the majority of people who succumb to influenza and the people who succumb to COVID-19? The vast majority of people who experience severe symptoms or even pass away from either of these infectious diseases have one or more pre-existing chronic illnesses. Some of the most recent data we have shows that nearly 90% of the patients who passed away with COVID-19 in New York City had at least one pre-existing chronic disease. This means their pre-existing disease and COVID are comorbidities. A comorbidity means that there are multiple illnesses that may be the cause of or strongly related to the cause of death. A study published in the Journal of the American Medical Association analyzed the data of COVID-19 patients in New York City and uncovered that the most common comorbidities were hypertension, diabetes, and obesity. Even though politicians and the sensationalized media make people believe that this virus is indiscriminately taking people's lives, the truth is that approximately 9 out of 10 people who pass away with COVID-19 already had a chronic disease that pre-subjected them to an abnormal immune response. Why does this not raise a huge alarm for us? Effective science doesn't look at this data and say, we just need to put superficial masks on people with chronic illnesses and wait for a couple of years to give them a drug that will save them. No, effective science says, clearly, the most susceptible people are those with chronic illnesses. Let's actually help them to improve or even eliminate those chronic illnesses. Let's get to work right now to get our citizens healthier. Obesity, heart disease, and type 2 diabetes are the leading issues that make our citizens more susceptible to a viral infection. Fixing these things and truly helping people with facts and not fear brings up another inconvenient truth that was recently published in the Journal of the American Medical Association. A 2018 peer-reviewed study found that poor diets are the #1 cause of poor health in the United States. Most of our country's chronic diseases are preventable and even reversible. The data shows that our food is the biggest issue, and this is something that we can fix. Do you really want to know why America was hit so hard by COVID-19? America is arguably the sickest and most vulnerable industrialized nation in the world. According to a recent CIA report, America has the highest rate of obesity of any nation with more than 40 million people. Right now, the United States has almost 200 million people who are either overweight or obese. And we have almost 125 million people who have lifestyle-related diabetes or prediabetes. We can't keep pretending this underlying problem doesn't exist. And we can't keep on pretending that this is something we can't fix. Instead of addressing what's truly our greatest health epidemic, the thing that takes millions of lives prematurely every year, and the thing that makes our citizens more susceptible to all of the infectious diseases that go around and will continue to go around, instead of finally addressing these issues with intelligence, people deflect and use other cognitive biases. Well, we can't just get people healthier overnight, and we definitely can't improve their immune system overnight. Yet again, the data shows that this belief is unequivocally untrue. You absolutely can improve someone's immune function that quickly, and you can absolutely demolish their immune function just as fast. If we look at the immune response of the millions of people who contracted COVID-19 and had mild symptoms or no symptoms at all, it wasn't a mask or magic drug that did the job. It was their immune system. It simply did the job that it's evolved to do. Our immune system has an array of very dynamic, highly intelligent weapons at its disposal, including cytotoxic T cells, interferons, B cells, and more. But what's of special significance against the coronavirus are our NK cells, also known as our natural killer cells. Our natural killer cells are so effective at killing coronavirus-infected cells that many pharmaceutical companies are scrambling to create vaccines that specifically manipulate your NK cells as a cure for COVID-19. In fact, the FDA has already cleared an experimental drug for natural killer cell-based COVID-19 therapy. But as usual, our conventional system that allows millions of people to die from preventable illnesses every year is looking at things through the lens of disease and pharmacology and not through the lens of what actually makes people healthy. We can improve the performance and production of natural killer cells in people who are susceptible starting now. We don't have to wait. However, the conflict of interest is that it's generally free and accessible for everyone to do. A study conducted at Appalachian State University found that simply going for a short walk boosts immune parameters, most notably for your natural killer cell blood counts. And data published in the journal Psychoneuroendocrinology found that sleep deprivation directly reduces the production and performance of your natural killer cells. Getting good sleep is more important than ever right now. But how many times have you seen anyone on major media tell you that? Yet another study, this one published in the peer-reviewed journal Stress and Health, found a significant correlation between the capacity of individuals to cope with daily life stress and their NK cell activity. Folks who don't cope well with stress have significantly lower natural killer cell activity. How has most people's stress management been through this experience? You already know the answer to that. And of course it's been terrible. All we've been fed when we look at major media and social media are reports reaffirming that there's nothing you can do about this, but suffocate yourself with a mask and hide out in your home. The truth is, you need to look at the basic laws of physiology more than ever right now. Your immune system needs oxygen to thrive. Yet for those who even have the courage to go outside in the open air, they're wrapping their faces in material that obstruct their breathing, not because of science and logic, but because of fear. A study published in the BMJ demonstrated that the fear of COVID-19 transmission in an open-air environment is illogical. You are almost 19 times less likely to contract the virus outside than by staying indoors. Scientists at the International Laboratory for Air Quality and Health at Queensland University of Technology stated that, quote, outdoors is safe, and there is certainly no cloud of virus-laden droplets hanging around. Firstly, any infectious droplets exhaled outside would be quickly diluted in outdoor air, so their concentrations would quickly become insignificant. In addition, the stability of the virus outside is significantly shorter than inside, so going outside is not a problem. It's safe to go for a walk and jog and not worry about the virus in the air, end quote. Going outside in the fresh air with a mask on is like, well, going outside in the fresh air with a mask on. It's not one of the shining moments of human advancement, but we can smarten up right now and stop acting like aliens on our own planet. Your immune system also needs the right nutrition to thrive. Your immune system, the thing that actually kills coronavirus, influenza, and every other pathogen that you come in contact with, guess what it's made of? It's made of the food that you eat. Every cell in your body, including your immune cells, are literally made from the food that you eat and the water that you drink. Yet you'd be hard-pressed to find an immunologist who's well-educated on nutrition, even though food is literally what makes your immune system. But that goes for every other field in conventional medicine. Being that your heart is made out of the food that you eat, you think that cardiologists receive a sufficient education in nutrition, but they hardly receive any at all. Can you start to see what's wrong with this picture and why heart disease is the #1 killer in this country every single year? Right now, make sure to eat plenty of real food and make sure to get in an array of micronutrients and omega-3 fatty acids. A study published in the Journal of Leukocyte Biology found omega-3s appear to enhance the function of humoral immune cells that are responsible for your body remembering a virus and building up a long-term resistance to it. Your immune system also needs sleep to thrive. During sleep, your immune system works to replenish immune cells and repair your immune-related organs. Research conducted by scientists at the Mayo Clinic found that people who don't get quality sleep or get enough sleep are far more likely to get sick after being exposed to a virus. Even though the vast majority of people who experience severe symptoms or even lost their life with COVID-19 infections had one or more pre-existing chronic diseases, another common deflection point is that perfectly healthy people die from it too. Unfortunately, this is true, but we look at it in a way that disempowers us. First, it causes us to justify the deaths of the other 90% of people who weren't, quote, perfectly healthy. It's like 18 people with chronic diseases are drowning, and 2 people without chronic diseases drown along with them. When their lives are lost, we say, 2 of those people were perfectly healthy. But in reality, all 20 could have been saved if we were doing the right thing to help them. Second, it doesn't matter how healthy someone appears to be. If you're sleep deprived, nutrient deficient, or excessively stressed, any of these things can increase your incidence of infection, increase the duration of illness, and increase the severity of an illness as well. None of us are immune from the basic laws of human physiology. For example, though it seems invisible, excess stress can be absolutely devastating to your immune system. Data reported in the Journal of the American Medical Association Internal Medicine reported that upwards of 80% of physician visits are for stress-related illnesses. While in another study published by the American Academy of Sleep Medicine, researchers affirmed that just 1 night of sleep deprivation can derange the immune system and increase your likelihood of infection. We have basic human needs that must be met, and this is our opportunity to help our communities to get educated to effectively meet them. What if every message to wear a mask was replaced with, or even coupled with, advice from health officials to help to reduce stress? Why stress management is essential in reducing your risk of infection, and provide some clinically proven stress management practices for everyone. What if every message to wear a mask was coupled with advice from health officials to make sure you're getting enough sleep right now? Why sleep is essential in reducing your risk of serious infection, and provide some simple, actionable steps that people can use to make it happen. With the motivation people have had to stay safe, we could have revolutionized our society by now. But that's not what we did. And that's why it's up to us to make this message go viral. When we hear a story like the origins of the beaked medical mask, we tend to think that it was so primitive and that we all have it figured out now. But every single day, we have new discoveries in science that have overturned long-held beliefs that were simply not true, unsubstantiated, and even outright dangerous. Arthur Schopenhauer stated that all truth passes through 3 stages. First, it's ridiculed. Second, it's violently opposed. Third, it is accepted as being self-evident. We need to transition through these phases quickly right now because millions of lives depend on it. Our children's lives depend on it, and our future depends on it. The next infectious disease is right around the corner, and the next one after that. Despite rapid advancements in medical science, our immune system is still the main weapon against infections. And if we don't fix the culture that's damaging our immune system, we'll continue to lose lives unnecessarily. The beauty of science is to be able to ask questions, to think from multiple perspectives, and to come to well thought out conclusions for ourselves. It's time to put facts over fear and to help our families and our communities to get healthier. We can no longer allow ourselves to be divided. We can no longer allow ourselves to abandon reason in the face of uncertainty. And we can no longer allow ourselves to abandon our humanity in the face of fear. It's time to implement real solutions for our citizens. And it's time to change our world for the better.